Have you ever wondered what happens behind the scenes in the spiritual world? Have you ever wondered what really lies behind pacts, rituals, and spells that promise prosperity and power? For years, a woman lived in the deepest abyss of darkness, witnessing things few dare even imagine. She didn't just see, she manipulated. It caused destruction, separated families, cast curses. She was known throughout the region as the most powerful witch in Nairobi, capable of bending reality and bringing chaos under simple spiritual commands. But what no one knew was that behind that facade of power there was a huge price. A price that drained his soul, that sucked the life out of him, as promises of prosperity turned into shackles of spiritual slavery. What happened next defies logic, surpasses understanding, and reveals a side of the supernatural that few know about. She witnessed the true power that hides behind spiritual pacts, and today she is here to reveal everything she experienced and how she managed to escape. But I invite you, don't leave here. Stay with me until the end, and I guarantee you, you will never see the spiritual world the same way again. Are you prepared to know the truth? My name is Salama Kendi. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, into a family that carried a dark spiritual legacy. Since I was little, my eyes have been accustomed to the occult. While other children played in the street, running carefree under the sun, I walked through corridors lit only by the flickering light of candles in rooms filled with ancestral symbols and altars stained with blood. It was no ordinary environment, and to me, that strong smell of burning herbs mixed with the odor of heavy incense was as familiar as the scent of a flower. I grew up believing that this was part of my destiny, that my path was already mapped out before I was even born. My mother, a priestess feared throughout the region, always said that the blood that ran through my veins carried the mark of the ancients. She was a woman with an imposing presence. Her eyes seemed to pierce the soul of whoever approached, as if she saw beyond matter, beyond the visible. My father, in turn, was a respected leader in black magic rituals. Men and women traveled from far and wide to seek his services, bringing with them offers and promises, desperate for solutions that only he seemed capable of delivering. I saw people crying, begging for revenge, for love, for prosperity. And there, in that dark room, surrounded by symbols and carvings in ancient wood, their desires were granted, but always at a high cost, much more than they were willing to pay. I remember one night in particular when I was just 7 years old. The full moon shone brightly over the rooftops of Nairobi, casting distorted shadows on the walls of the temple my parents kept secret. That night, my mother held my hand and led me to the central altar. There were black candles arranged in a perfect circle, and the floor was painted with symbols that I still didn't fully understand. "Today you will take the first step towards becoming who you were born to be," she said, with a firm voice and a determined look. My bare feet touched the cold floor, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She then handed me a small dagger, decorated with dark stones. "Cut the palm of your hand and let the blood fall onto the circle," he ordered. I hesitated for a moment, but her gaze allowed no doubt. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made a small cut, watching the blood slowly drip onto the symbols on the floor. Instantly, something changed in the air around us. The temperature dropped, and an icy wind swept through the room, blowing out some candles. I heard whispers, as if distant voices were approaching, murmuring words I couldn't understand. My eyes opened, and for the first time, I saw them, shadows, figures that moved around us, lurking, observing. I knew they weren't human. I knew it didn't belong in our world. But somehow I didn't feel afraid, just curious. From that day on, my spiritual vision began to expand. I saw things that no one else saw. I could walk through the streets of Nairobi and see shadows following people, figures watching children playing, entities hiding in dark corners. My parents said it was a gift inherited from our family's ancient lineage. "They're always here, Salama, just waiting for someone to see them," my mother used to say, with a smile that mixed pride and a touch of mystery. Over time, I realized that those entities didn't just watch me, they obeyed me. At the slightest whisper, I could feel them move, as if awaiting my instructions. When I turned 10, I was able to perform complete rituals on my own. My mother said I was a prodigy, that my power was much greater than she had imagined. Soon, people started coming to me, looking for solutions, asking for spells, begging for answers, and each ritual I performed seemed to further strengthen the connection between me and those figures. But there was something more, something I still didn't fully understand. I saw them even when I didn't want to see them. I felt their presence around me, watching me, whispering in languages I didn't know. At night, sleep was a challenge. Sounds of footsteps echoed in the hallways, even when I was alone. Walls creaked, as if someone was walking on the other side, but there was no one there, or at least no one visible to human eyes. I knew I was being watched, monitored. My mother said this was a good sign, that it meant I was ready. But ready for what? That was the question I didn't have the courage to ask. Salama's first steps into the spiritual world demonstrate how the occult can seduce with the promise of power and control, but in reality only delivers invisible prisons and a dangerous connection to forces beyond human understanding. The shadows that watched her were a sign that something much bigger was at play, and that the path out of it would be darker and more tortuous than anyone could imagine. Want to know what happened after Salama started controlling these spirits? Stay with me, because the next part will reveal the true price of this power, and I guarantee you will be surprised. Sign up now and hit the bell so you don't miss this dark and shocking revelation. When I turned 15, my mother took me to a special ritual. "Today you will receive spiritual eyes," she said, with a smile that mixed pride and something I couldn't decipher. That night we walked to the Ngong Hills forest, a place considered sacred for our rituals. The path was narrow and surrounded by tall, gnarled trees whose shadows seemed to move around us. The full moon illuminated the treetops, casting distorted figures on the ground as the wind blew, whispering ancient secrets that seemed to echo in the silence of the night. Every step I took seemed to take me further away from the ordinary world and take me into something deep and mysterious, as if the forest itself was swallowing us. When we arrived, there was a circle marked on the floor, surrounded by black candles that flickered as if they were alive. Strange symbols were drawn around, carved with precision into the dirt floor. The smell of burning incense filled the air, thick and suffocating. I watched my mother carefully as she organized every detail, lighting the candles in a specific order and whispering words in a language I didn't know but that reverberated in the air as if it had weight. The winds began to intensify, whistling through the trees, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was changing. The air became heavy, difficult to breathe, and the sounds of the forest suddenly fell silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. My mother then approached me and handed me a small dagger with a silver blade and symbols engraved across the length of the metal. "Blood is the key that opens the eyes," she said, as her eyes stared straight at me. I looked at the blade in my hands, cold and heavy, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. Without hesitation, I made a small cut on my palm, and the warm blood slowly flowed out, dripping onto the symbols on the floor. At the same moment, the wind stopped, and an overwhelming silence took over the place. My mother began to chant in a deep, almost guttural tone. The words came out of his mouth like a hypnotic whisper, and I felt my senses sharpen. The air seemed to vibrate, and the shadows around us lengthened, writhing, as if awakening from a deep sleep. Suddenly I felt a crushing weight on my shoulders, as if invisible hands were holding me down, pressing me to the ground. My eyes began to burn, an unbearable pain that made me scream. But the sound of my voice seemed to disappear in the wind. Everything around me began to grow dark, and I could barely see the candles flickering in front of me. That's when it happened. In the midst of that suffocating darkness, my eyes opened in a way I had never experienced. Shadows began to form around me, shapes that belonged to nothing I could explain. They were tall, slender figures, with shining eyes that watched me in silence. I knew my mother couldn't see them, but to me, it was as if they were as real as the earth beneath my feet. They moved slowly around the circle, approaching me, surrounding me, whispering words I couldn't understand. At that moment, I knew the ritual had worked. My spiritual eyes were open, and I could see what no one else could see. The figures did not dissipate, they did not disappear with the light. They remained, observing, following my every movement. The feeling of power swept through my body like a wave, and I smiled, feeling invincible. But there was something in their eyes that bothered me. It wasn't reverence, it was possession, as if I were theirs. From that day on, the world was never the same. I walked the streets of Nairobi and saw them everywhere. Shadows that watched, figures that hid in corners, entities that whispered between the trees. To others, they were just dark corners, harmless shadows, but I knew they were there, waiting, watching, always lurking. And even without wanting to, I felt them following me, watching me, marking me. And you, can you imagine what Salama saw when his spiritual eyes were opened? Have you had contact with the supernatural at any point in your life? Yes or no? Reply in the comments and tell me your experience. And don't miss the next part. What Salama will discover about these entities will completely change the course of his life. My first spiritual pact was sealed at 17 years old. At that time, I already mastered spells and curses as naturally as other people prepared a meal. I was known as the Young Witch of Nairobi, and my name quickly spread to distant villages. People came from far and wide, crossing dusty roads and dense forests, bringing with them stories of pain, revenge, and despair. They came to me looking for answers and solutions that ordinary life could not offer. For each of these jobs, there was a price, and it was paid without question. But what many didn't know is that the true cost wasn't the money, nor the jewelry they offered me. The payment was much deeper. It was the soul itself. I clearly remember the first time I experienced this power in its darkest form. It was a silent and cold night. The dim candlelight cast long shadows on the walls of the room, creating distorted figures that seemed to move in time with the flames. A man appeared at my door, his eyes filled with hatred and bitterness. His name was Kiptu, and he carried the weight of revenge on his shoulders. He stole everything from me. I want him to suffer. I want him to pay for what he did, he said, his voice shaking with resentment. My mother, sitting next to the altar, just observed the scene with the serenity of someone who already knew what was coming. Are you willing to pay the price? I asked as his eyes met mine, firm without hesitation. Kiptu nodded, and it was there that the ritual began. The room was filled with an intense cold, as if the heat had been sucked out of the walls. The candles flickered, and I began to sing songs I had learned as a child. Words in an ancient language, secrets kept for generations. The smoke from the incense sticks spiraled through the air, and I could feel the shadows approaching, bowing to my voice. I placed a piece of fabric he had brought, something that had belonged to his brother, on the altar. Next to it, a bowl of black chicken blood, a symbol of spiritual connection. I took the ritualistic dagger I had inherited from my mother and made a small cut in my own palm, letting the blood flow onto the fabric. May suffering find the one who stole from you, I whispered, as I watched the red drops spread across the surface of the altar. The feeling was indescribable. A shiver ran down my spine, and the shadows around me seemed to stir, to move as if thirsty for the outcome. That same night, Kiptu returned home with a promise of revenge made. And me? I felt something different. It was as if an invisible chain had been placed around my body, a spiritual weight that grew with each ritual performed. But at that time, I didn't understand what that meant. For me, it was just power, proof that I was capable of controlling the destinies of others with just a few words and a handful of symbols. But the truth was different. With each ritual, I was binding myself more and more without knowing that the shackles were not being forged on others, but on myself. Salama's first pact marked the beginning of a dark and irreversible journey. Each ritual performed increased her fame, but also chained her soul in ways she could not yet understand. The thirst for power hid the true cost that was being exacted in secret. And you, have you ever wondered to what extent the desire for power can imprison a soul? Leave a broken heart in the comments and share your opinion. As time passed, the effects of the pacts began to haunt me. At first, it was just a cold feeling that intensified when I was alone. I could be in a bright room, in the middle of the day, and still feel a chill run down my spine, as if invisible fingers were touching my skin. At night, the dreams were disturbing. I found myself in dark places, shadowy forests where voices whispered my name through the trees, calling to me with a disturbing familiarity. I woke up in a cold sweat with the echo of those whispers still reverberating in my ears. They didn't stop, they insisted. They got closer. Even when I tried to cover my ears, the whispers pierced the silence, invading my thoughts. I remember one night in particular. It was raining in Nairobi and the wind howled through the windows of the house. I was alone, finishing arranging the altars after a ritual, when I felt something different in the air. A heaviness, as if the atmosphere were too thick to breathe. The candles flickered without a draft, and I could see from the corner of my eyes shadows moving slowly, leaning against the walls, projecting silhouettes that didn't belong to anything physical. I blinked several times, trying to shake off the sensation, but they remained motionless, watching me. My fingers shook and I let one of the incense sticks fall to the floor, scattering ash over the drawn symbol. The shadows advanced a little further and the air grew colder. It was at that moment that I realized I was no longer in control. Those entities, previously obedient to my commands, now seemed to collect a debt. Their whispers, previously distant, were now muffled screams, laments that echoed in the hallways of the house during the early hours of the morning. Doors creaked by themselves. Windows rattled even when the wind was calm. My body started to get sick. My hands shook frequently. My eyes had deep circles under my eyes, and my once vibrant skin was now pale, almost translucent. It was as if something was slowly sucking my vitality, draining my energy. Once, during a ritual, a woman came to me. His eyes were red from crying, and his hands were shaking as he held a thick envelope of money. "I want him to feel the pain I felt," she said, handing me a photo of her boss. She said that she had been unfairly fired, accused of something she didn't do, and now she was willing to pay any price to make him suffer. Her anger was so intense, it seemed contagious. I accepted the request without question. I prepared the altar as always, sang the songs, and invoked the spirits, asking them to fulfill that woman's wish. When the ritual ended, the room fell into a deep, almost suffocating silence. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I opened the door, there was no one. 3 days later, I learned that the man had been hospitalized with a rare and unexplained illness. Doctors were unable to identify the source of his symptoms, and his condition worsened day by day. At first, it brought me a feeling of sick pleasure. The power to shape the destinies of others was intoxicating. The idea that my words, my chants, my hands could make such an impact gave me a feeling of absolute control. But that feeling was short-lived. The screams started to return. I listened to them on silent Nairobi nights. Voices crying, lamenting, calling my name with a disturbing intensity. They seemed to follow me, whispering in my ears, repeating words I didn't understand. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was as if they were attached to me, as if every spell, every curse cast was a thread tied to my soul. And the more I tried to push them away, the closer they got. The spiritual weight was unbearable, and for the first time I felt afraid of what I had become. The consequences of spiritual pacts began to take their toll. The shadows that had previously obeyed silently now seemed to demand something in return. Salama was trapped in a cycle of darkness that showed no signs of ending. Every ritual, every curse cast, brought back echoes of suffering and laments that could not be silenced. And do you believe that the choices we make in the spiritual world can haunt us forever? Yes or no? Share your opinion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you were in Salama's shoes. And don't miss the next part. What these voices whisper to her will reveal a dark and terrifying secret. The spiritual. Chains became heavier. I couldn't sleep anymore. It was as if an invisible presence was always lurking, watching my every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nightmares haunted me every night. Dreams so real that I could smell the damp earth, the biting cold of the shadows that enveloped me, and the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. Figures appeared even during the day, skirting doors, peering through windows, like living shadows that crept through the dark corners of the house. My mother told me it was the path of initiation, that I was being purified to become an even more powerful priestess. Her eyes shone with pride, and she watched my every move expectantly, as if silently awaiting my ascension. But inside me, I knew that was a lie. Those figures didn't look like a celebration. They looked like a charge, and they were getting closer and closer. I remember one day in particular. The sky over Nairobi was grey, filled with dark clouds that seemed to weigh down the city. My mother called me to a special ritual. She had prepared the altar with more care than usual. Black candles lined up in a perfect circle, intertwined with symbols drawn in fresh blood. In the center, a clay jar containing herbs and bones that gave off a strong, almost suffocating smell. I sat down before the altar, as I did so many other times, and began to sing the songs. The smoke from the incense rose in spirals, contouring my body, filling every corner of the room with a dense veil. That's when it happened. In the middle of the ritual, as I recited the chants, I felt something change in the air. The environment became cold, freezing as if it were the middle of winter despite the heat outside. My vision became blurred, the candles flickered violently, and a feeling of vertigo came over me. Everything around me was spinning. The symbols on the floor seemed to move, dancing to their own rhythm. I tried to stand up, but my legs gave out, and I fell to the ground, slamming my knees against the stone floor. The impact was so strong that I felt my bones vibrate. When I opened my eyes, a dark figure was standing before me. It was tall, imposing, shrouded in a blanket of shadows that seemed to move like dense smoke. His eyes glowed red like glowing coals, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like thunder that echoed off the walls of the hall. "You are mine," he declared, each word reverberating in the air like a deep echo. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. It was as if something invisible had wrapped itself around my throat, silencing me completely. My muscles were paralyzed, frozen in a forced position, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move a single finger. The figure approached slowly, each step an echo, a tremor in the walls around us. He reached out his hand, and his elongated black fingers seemed to wrap around the air, grabbing my soul before they even touched my skin. When his cold hand touched my forehead, a shock ran through my body, and I felt as if invisible chains were attaching themselves to my body, squeezing me so tightly that the air escaped my lungs. My eyes closed involuntarily, and I saw distorted images, figures dancing in a circle, voices that whispered my name in languages I didn't know. The feeling was overwhelming. I almost lost consciousness. And there are spiritual pacts that bind people invisibly. Do you believe this? Yes or no? Leave your comment sharing what you think about it. After that dark experience, something changed in me. My mother told me that I was finally aligned with the spirits, that the connection was now complete. And in a suit, he seemed to be. Customers increased, fame spread like wildfire across the savannah, and money began to flow. People came from all over Nairobi, some even crossed borders, bringing with them stories of suffering, revenge, and hidden desires. I became known for making love ties, bringing financial prosperity, and most importantly, taking down enemies. The feeling of power was addictive. I felt like I was finally living what I was promised, absolute control over the destinies of others. When I walked through the streets, people looked away. Some made discreet signs of protection, but no one dared challenge me. This fear fueled me, reinforced the illusion that I was above the consequences, but the reality was very different. The money came into my hands, but disappeared just as quickly. I remember counting stacks of bills, keeping them in safes, but in some inexplicable way they disappeared, disintegrating into debts and urgent needs that appeared out of nowhere. Things in my house started to deteriorate. The water in the pipes suddenly dried up, as if it had been drained by invisible hands. The food I bought would rot in a matter of hours, covered in dense black mold. Strange illnesses appeared on my skin, dark spots that slowly spread, leaving a burning sensation and constant pain. The material goods I obtained with the pacts crumbled like sand between my fingers. It was like trying to hold back smoke. Nothing remained. I remember a specific client, a businessman who came to me with eyes filled with hatred and a desire for revenge. He wanted to destroy a competitor who, according to him, had stolen his contracts and tarnished his name in the market. I want him to lose everything. I want him to feel what I felt firsthand. I want him to be ruined, he said, placing an envelope stuffed with money on the table. I accepted. The ritual was performed under the pale light of the full moon. The altar was ready, the candles burned slowly, and the blood of a sacrificed animal was poured onto the symbols traced on the floor. Chants resounded in the air, and I invoked the spirits who always responded to my call. It was a ritual of destruction, a spell specifically for financial ruin and personal disgrace. The man he hated fell into ruin a few weeks later. He lost his contracts, his company went bankrupt, and his name was tarnished by scandals that mysteriously emerged. My client was satisfied, came back to thank me, and brought even more money to reinforce the spiritual work. But what he didn't expect was that, shortly after, the same misfortunes began to knock on his door. Businesses went bankrupt one by one, employees left the company, contracts were broken without explanation. The family, once united, fell apart in fights and accusations. A few months later, he was found wandering the streets of Nairobi, with torn clothes and a disturbed mind, muttering nonsensical things. Seeing him in that situation, a question took root in my mind. What was the true price of magic? Have you ever stopped to think that the price of revenge could be much higher than we imagine? Tell me what you believe about this in the comments. And stay tuned. The next part will reveal what Salama discovered about the true cost of these pacts. It was then that I started trying to pull away. The voices that had previously guided me through rituals now screamed in my ears, accusing me, persecuting me. What was previously whispered in almost peaceful tones now came as desperate, threatening screams, tearing up the silence of the early morning hours. I saw shadows in the corners of my room, figures that approached while I slept. They no longer hid. Before, they moved subtly, discreetly, almost imperceptibly. But now, they were walking towards me, extending their invisible hands trying to touch me. I felt an icy shiver every time they passed by. It felt like the air around me was becoming dense, heavy, as if it were surrounding me in currents that I couldn't see, but that I could feel. The spirits that previously obeyed me now demanded more sacrifices, more pain, more destruction. It wasn't just a demand, it was an insatiable hunger, an appetite for suffering that I could no longer feed. The voices whispered constantly, waking me up in the middle of the night, invading my dreams, leaving me restless. I remember one day in particular when I sat at the altar, trying to light the candles for a ritual, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the match. It was as if my very energy was being drained, sucked away to feed something I couldn't see but felt in every fiber of my being. I decided I needed to get off that path, but it wasn't that simple. The first attempt was a disaster. I woke up in the middle of the night with pressure in my chest so intense that I couldn't breathe. My eyes were open, but I saw nothing but darkness. The room, which I knew so well, seemed to have turned into an endless abyss. The air was thick, heavy, as if each breath was a struggle against an invisible weight. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel their presence, shadows that moved silently, gliding along the walls, approaching my bed. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were low, almost imperceptible, but they soon intensified. Overlapping, distorted voices mixed in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was mocking. They laughed at me, at my attempt to escape, at my weakness, and when the laughter stopped, the whispers turned to threats. They told me to give up, that there was no escape, that I was theirs and always would be. I felt something cold touch my face, like invisible fingers scratching my skin. It was cold, so cold that my skin burned to the touch. I screamed until my voice disappeared, but no one heard me. It was as if my words were muffled, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded me. My arms burned, and I felt like something was squeezing them, holding them tight. When it finally dawned, and the first rays of sunlight invaded my room, I dragged myself to the mirror. I lifted the sleeves of my blouse, and there they were, deep marks, like scratches that had been dug into the skin, red lines that intertwined in shapes I didn't recognize. That terrified me. Each attempt to leave that world was met with even more intense attacks. I was trapped, and now I knew it wasn't so easy to escape. The voices grew louder, the shadows grew bolder, and the whispers, once distant, now manifested themselves in clear, threatening words. I started to understand that it wasn't just about leaving that path. It was about breaking spiritual chains that imprisoned me, but I didn't know how. The spiritual currents that Salama faced were not symbolic. They were real, palpable, and with each attempt to escape, they seemed to tighten even more. The spiritual world that once seemed to offer power now appeared to be a dark and unforgiving prison. With each attempt to escape, the spiritual chains tighten even more. Will Salama be able to free himself from this darkness? Write in the comments, "Go strong, Salama," to show your support in this spiritual battle. Desperate, I started looking for help. I visited healers, sought out other witches, delved into even deeper rituals, but nothing relieved the weight I felt. It was as if invisible chains were attached to my spirit, tightening every time I tried to escape. The weight was suffocating, a constant presence that dragged with me wherever I went. My days became endless, and the nights became a battlefield. I didn't sleep anymore. I could barely close my eyes without being tormented by voices, shadows, and nightmares that seemed too real to be just a product of my mind. The air in my home was thick, filled with an oppression that seemed to whisper that I would never escape. That was when, by chance, or perhaps for a greater purpose, I passed in front of a small church in the center of Nairobi. I was walking aimlessly, lost in my own thoughts, when I heard voices echoing from inside. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. They were not chants of invocation, nor murmurs of spells. They were voices that seemed to fill the air with something I couldn't identify, something light, pure as peace. My body stopped as if my feet were rooted to the ground. The service had already begun, and the faithful sang with their hands raised, their eyes closed, their faces turned upward. That scene intrigued me. The atmosphere was different, the air was light, almost as if it could be touched. I felt an inexplicable force drawing me to that place. My feet moved one step forward and then another, but I resisted. I didn't want to go in. I couldn't go in. Everything inside me screamed for me to leave, for me to continue on my way. But something I couldn't explain pushed me. An invisible force led me to the door, and before I knew it, I was standing there, watching people praying with their hands raised. I felt a warmth pass through my body, as if the air itself was moving around me. The peace I saw there disarmed me. I had never seen anything like this before. That's when it happened. The pastor, who was preaching from the pulpit with a firm and confident voice, suddenly stopped. He looked directly at me, even though I was in the middle of a crowd, and said out loud, "There is someone here who has been marked by darkness, but the Lord says, 'I have come to set the captives free. Today, the chains will be broken.'" The words echoed in my ears, cutting through my mind like a blade. My heart raced, my legs felt shaky, and I felt an inexplicable heat spread through my body. My knees gave way, and I fell. I cried like I had never cried before. The voices inside me screamed for me to get out of there, but something stronger kept me on the ground, trapped in that place of light. It was as if a battle was being fought there, between the shadows that chased me and that light that now enveloped me. The pastor approached, walking slowly between the pews, and placed his hands on my head. His eyes were closed, and his voice was firm, unforgiving. He began to pray with authority, and I felt as if something was burning inside me, as if flames were coursing through my veins. The heat increased and my vision went dark for a few seconds. I screamed, I struggled, but I couldn't let go. It was as if invisible chains were being ripped from my soul. The light radiating from the altar seemed to intensify, filling the entire room. I felt something breaking inside me, as if layers of darkness were being forcibly removed. My screams turned to sobs, and for the first time, I felt peace. A deep silence enveloped me, as if all the voices had been silenced at once. At that moment, kneeling on that cold floor, I understood that something had changed forever. Salama experienced the light it releases for the first time, a force that transcends the physical world, capable of breaking chains that seemed unbreakable. That peace she felt wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. It was as if a weight she had carried since childhood had been lifted. The battle was just beginning, but this was the first sign of hope. Do you believe that spiritual power can break invisible chains? Write in the comments, cry out to God if you believe she deserves to continue fighting for her release. After that day, I knew I couldn't go back. The light I had experienced at that altar had ignited something in me that I couldn't explain, but that burned brightly. My life was changed, but I also knew that the spiritual struggle was just beginning. The attacks increased, the nightmares intensified, and the figures that previously obeyed me now attacked me with a fury I had never experienced. Sleepless nights, shadows that moved in the corners of rooms, voices that whispered my name, calling me back into the darkness. But I had something I didn't have before, faith in a God greater than all that darkness. I started attending church regularly. Every Sunday there I was, sitting in the front pew, trying to absorb every word, every preaching. I participated in liberation meetings, where hands were raised over me, prayers were cried out loud, and the atmosphere was filled with a peace that I had never felt before. I remember the day I was baptized. The water was freezing, but when I emerged, something inside me felt like it had been broken. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Spiritual chains broke a little more with each prayer. I felt day after day the invisible shackles that bound me breaking one by one. But the attacks did not stop. It seemed like the closer I got to the light, the more the darkness tried to pull me back. There were nights when I woke up with my body paralyzed, feeling an invisible weight on my chest. My legs didn't move, my voice didn't come out, and I could only hear whispers that echoed around the room, voices that accused me, that called me back into the darkness. On one of those nights, as I was trying to fight against that invisible oppression, I heard a sound that seemed very far away, It was a soft melody, voices singing a hymn that I knew from church. The music echoed throughout the house, and the heaviness disappeared. At that moment, I knew something was changing. There was one day in particular when, during a prayer vigil, something extraordinary happened. The church was packed, people were praying loudly, some were crying, others were raising their hands fervently. The pastor walked between the pews, laying hands on the faithful, praying for deliverance. I felt light, but at the same time, something inside me seemed to stir. The sensation grew, a pressure in the chest, an intense pain that increased with each word that was said. I knew what was happening. The spiritual weight I carried was being exposed. I fell to my knees, and at that moment, it felt like my entire body was on fire. My hands were shaking, my vision became blurry, and I started vomiting something that was unnatural. A dark, thick substance with an unbearable smell was coming out of me. It was as if all the evil that had accumulated over the years was being expelled violently, ripped out of me. The people around me began to pray even louder, crying out for the blood of Jesus, and I could feel something breaking into invisible pieces that fell to the ground. The entire church cried out. The sound of prayers filled the room, and when finally the last trace of that substance left my body, I fell to the floor. Silence took over the place, and for a moment, everything was still. I opened my eyes, still on my knees, and for the first time, I felt peace. It wasn't just a physical relief. It was spiritual. The invisible chains that bound me had been broken, and I knew in that moment that I was completely free. Salama's experience shows that spiritual power is real, both to imprison and to liberate. The invisible chains that held her bound were broken by the force of something greater than any ritual she had known. True freedom came not from magic, but from the faith that transformed his life forever. Do you believe that true spiritual liberation only happens through faith? Write in the comments, I believe, if you also believe in the power of spiritual liberation. Today, I'm here to tell you that magic doesn't give you power, it imprisons you. I know, because I experienced it firsthand. For years, I was deluded by the false gloss of promises of control and power. Every ritual I performed, every pact I sealed, was an invisible chain that wrapped itself around my soul, trapping me in a darkness that seemed to have no end. At first, it seemed glorious. People came to me with requests for revenge, love ties, financial prosperity. I believed I had control over the destinies of others, but the reality was very different. With each spell cast, each ritual performed, something was taken from me. My peace, my health, my sleep. I was being sucked away little by little, without realizing that what seemed like power was in fact slavery. The pacts that seem harmless, the rituals that seem like just superstition, all of these are a direct path to spiritual slavery. I remember when clients came to me, some with desperate looks, others full of hatred, wanting justice in their own hands. And I did. He cast curses, broke marriages, destroyed businesses with the simple chanting of ancient words. The power I felt was addictive, but what no one saw was the price I paid. During the night, figures walked around my room, whispering, demanding more sacrifices. My body began to waste away. My eyes were always tired, and darkness followed me wherever I went. That wasn't freedom, it was invisible captivity. But there is a name that is above all names. A name that, when called out, made all those shadows dissipate. I didn't believe there could be a way out. For years, my mind was trapped in the idea that there was no return, that chains were eternal, that pacts could never be undone. But the truth is that there is someone who breaks chains, who rescues captives, who returns life to those who have been marked by darkness. The day I stepped into that church, dragged by a force I couldn't explain, was the day the light came into my path, a path that was once dark, but was now illuminated by grace. I'm here to tell you, choose the light, choose Jesus. Don't wait until it's too late. The devil uses magic to trap you spiritually, but the grace of God can free you. No matter how deep you have sunk, no matter how strong the chains that bind you, there is a greater power, a name that sets you free, a path that can rescue you from all the suffering that seems endless. I was a witness to the power of darkness, but I was also rescued by the light. And if God could free me, I assure you, He can also set you free. Magic promises power, but delivers slavery. Only he who knows the true light is able to free himself from the invisible chains that bind the soul. Salama found this light and was rescued from a path of no return. This is proof that no one is too lost to be saved. If this story impacted you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next testimonies. There is much more to be revealed, real experiences of liberation and rebirth that will transform your vision of the spiritual world. And click now on the next video. What you will discover will forever change the way you see the supernatural.